Don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these heterodox conversations for complexity. Hello again, and thanks for tuning in. Just a couple notes that I'd like to make. As a reminder, our website is wegrowteachers.com, and although we have changed names from Teach Thought PD to Thought Stretchers Education, all of our services like project-based learning, inquiry, differentiated instruction, and much more are all available there as professional development and learning opportunities. If you're looking to grow your school, please visit us there or email me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org. We're also getting closer to the official launch of our Thought Stretchers community. If you're interested, we do have a landing page there, which is at wegrowteachers.com/thoughtstretchers. There we hope to host and give a space for K-12 stakeholders to think more deeply about some of the more contentious issues, from pedagogy to culture war issues. And again, wegrowteachers.com/thoughtstretchers. You can sign up for the email list, which will let you know when we officially launch. So we're very excited about that, and hopefully that will happen very soon. In this episode, I spoke with Andy Farley, who is a principal in Wisconsin and the NASSP Principal of the Year. NASSP is the National Association of Secondary School Principals. We talked about their priorities on student wellness and equity of learning opportunities for students and teacher pipelines and things of that nature. We touched on expectations of learning, their policy dealing with phones in schools for students and how that relates to student wellness, and talked about the pedagogical approach that they focus on and instructional leadership related to that. And ended the conversation talking a bit more about the outside pressures with culture war kinds of political issues that might be pressing into the schools and how they have dealt with those things. I enjoyed the conversation, and as always, I hope it's helpful. And without further ado, here's Andy Farley. Andy, welcome to the podcast. As usual, I want to give our listeners an opportunity to get to know you and give you an opportunity to introduce yourself. So here you go. Tell our listeners who you are and maybe a little bit about your work and where you are and those kinds of things.
Yeah, sounds great. Thanks, Drew, for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity. I'm Andy Farley. I'm the principal here at Brookfield East High School in Brookfield, Wisconsin. We are a suburb of Milwaukee in the southeastern corner of the great state of Wisconsin. We are a 9th through 12th grade high school, about 1,400 students. Our mission statement is our commitment to academic and human excellence, and we're really excited to be better tomorrow than we were today. So I'm really excited to join you here for this conversation.
All right, thank you. And you have recently been named, I don't know if you get a belt or anything for this, the NASSP National Principal of the Year. So NASSP, for folks who are not familiar with that, is the National Association of Secondary School Principals. And we've had Ron Nazo, who's the CEO, on the podcast some time ago now. And I want to say maybe a couple other folks that are associated with NASSP, but yeah, well, congratulations, I suppose. And now they've booked you to do all these media tours and talk with people like myself. So I'm curious, what's the process like to become National Principal of the Year?
That's a great question. I think it starts at the state level. So in the state of Wisconsin here, we have a Cole Fellowship process. So it's named after former U.S. Senator Herb Cole in the state of Wisconsin. He's been a tremendous champion for education and gives tens of thousands of grants every year at the state level to students that as they transition to their college or university of choice. So for me, it started with a student nomination to that Cole Fellowship Award, and then you complete an application process. And last spring, our State Association of Administration notified me that I was the state secondary principal of the year, and completely humbling and honoring event and recognition. So grateful for our state association for that. And really grateful for that student nomination. I think in education, no one gets into it for the recognition. We get into it for the opportunity to add value to the lives of students and schools, and more importantly, communities. So from that standpoint, you take each of the 50 state principals of the year from the secondary level, and you go into the national process, and they interview the final 3 finalists. So I was notified in July that I was one of the 3 finalists, and then they announced it probably 2 weeks ago, Friday night in DC, where they bring all 50 secondary principals together for an amazing professional development experience in Washington, DC, where you get to gather and share ideas, share vision, share common problems in practice and how you're solving those problems and wins in your schools and community. And so it's been quite the process, and so appreciative of our NASSP for the recognition and the opportunity to talk about education and teaching and learning and meeting the needs of kids and making sure we're meeting the needs of our communities and growing great humans and growing students that are ready to take on the challenges of a ever-growing global community.
Okay, well, that's quite a process, quite a mouthful, and curious because so my mom was a teacher, my grandmother was a teacher, and my mom was at one point a principal in several different schools, and she at one point had encouraged me to try to follow that path, and I said, "You're crazy." I would characterize, or often characterize, principals, the job of a principal as, I don't know, maybe worst is not the correct term. In some ways it's great, right? But in the sense of there are just about every stakeholder in the ecosystem is pointing at you and wondering why in the heck you're not making all the changes and doing all these things, because you're the boss, and you've got the board, you've got the superintendent, you've got the parents, you've got the students, and I'm probably missing some other stakeholders. They all want what they want and look at you and say, make this happen. And one of the things about the principal job is that it doesn't necessarily and usually doesn't have the autonomy that people imagine that it does, right? You can't just flip switches and make things happen, especially in larger schools and larger districts. But I'm curious, what was your process? I'm assuming you were a teacher before you became a principal and an administrator. What was that journey like?
Yeah, it's a great question. I spent 13 years in the classroom as a high school social studies teacher. So love American history, taught AP psychology, which I loved, taught a class called Current Issues that I believe all students should take at some point in their high school career, that talks about the ever-changing economic, political, social dynamics within regions, countries, and our global community. I had 13 years as a high school social studies teacher, then transitioned to a associate principal position for a year, and then I'm back at Brookfield East where I taught. So I actually graduated from this high school as well. So played a number of roles in my career, from a student to a teacher to a coach to now principal. So Brookfield East in Elmbrook here in southeastern Wisconsin is a special district. Amazing teachers, amazing educators that fortunate to serve on this faculty in that role of teacher for greater than a decade.
Well, I had a sense that some of your story would be what you just recounted, and I don't know why. Maybe it's just instinctual, but I was a social studies teacher, also taught AP psychology, also coached. So you are living the counterfactual to what my mother apparently had recommended. I did not go into administration. I'd chosen a much different path, but it is interesting. I wonder if there's got to be some data out there about social studies teachers becoming administrators. I'm sure there's got to be something. It surely intuitively seems like there's a connection there, but perhaps I'm just imagining things. So one of the things you mentioned, talking about going to Washington, D.C., that I think is an interesting, I would have interest in hearing the conversation that you mentioned, among other things, professional development. But one of the things that you talked about or you mentioned was that, I guess, collectively and collaboratively with the folks that were gathered there, talking about common problems. And I'm curious what those common problems, what sort of were the priorities and things that are top, I guess, common problems.
Yeah, and maybe I phrased that the wrong way. Problems of practice certainly are one hand, but then the secondary piece, or probably should argue the primary piece, is what we're all working on, right? And every school leader, every educator in the country is working on creating classroom cultures and school cultures where every student feels safe, emotionally, physically stretched or appropriately challenged and supported by an amazing adult that seeks to build that student's potential and academic skills and knowledge and confidence to be successful, not only in that class, but build transferable skills to be successful in all classes and, more importantly, outside of our school. So I think building thriving school cultures is always a priority of school leaders. I think when we talk about that, you're talking about academic achievement. How do we make sure students are excelling academically? How are we ensuring that all students have equal access to rigorous learning experiences, regardless of their grade, regardless of the content area? So I think that's a priority. All of us are talking about mental health of students and mental wellness of students, and how do we continue to promote a comprehensive form of wellness for our students and our staff and for our communities. And then I would also add teacher pipeline. We're all aware of the decreasing teacher pipeline, certainly locally, certainly nationally. How do we rally around common ideas or common vision or common opportunities to make sure not only that we build a teacher pipeline, but we retain great teachers right now that all the research says may be, sort of wondering if they want to maintain in the profession. And I think schools that excel have continuity among their staff. They build continuity. It's the same teachers every year. It's the same relationship every year. And you build a sense of team and community within small teams at the department or professional learning community level, but then you also build a greater team within the schools level with a common vision of student success and engagement and wellness.
So, sort of talking about like equity and wellness and of students, but then also teacher pipeline, which is also connected to wellness, because as I've written about, and it's certainly no secret to those who have worked in education, teaching is a hard job. Being a really good teacher is really, really hard. And it seems like it's becoming more and more difficult with outside pressures and influences. And perhaps we can talk about some of those things. But when I think about the ways in which sort of tackling the ecosystem of school improvement and school culture and some of these things, I think about sort of purpose, which is sort of mission, like what is our purpose, and you talked about the mission there, but then also curriculum, systems, and practices. And I'm curious how you think about, especially the sort of systems and practices. What are the sort of pedagogy pieces that you emphasize, and how do you navigate that? I add a little bit more color to that question is, there's, I suppose, a perception, and I don't think it's unfounded, at least not in my experience, that teacher preparation programs seem to be woefully inadequate oftentimes in preparing teachers to be great teachers. I'm certain that there are some exceptions to that. There's no doubt. I remember talking with the Dean of Education at UW-Madison and was very impressed by that. So perhaps, and I'm drawing a blank on her name, perhaps you know her name. It's been quite a while since I talked with her. We were talking about sort of freedom of speech kinds of things, freedom of expression. But the ways in which teachers come into the profession and then development of those teachers, are they paying attention to research? What are the points of emphasis and focus and those kinds of things that you would say are priorities or should be priorities, or are those priorities the same across schools?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. One of your earlier comments was about instruction. And I think the role of school leaders, the most important role we have is who we put in front of kids every day, right? Like the teacher in front of students is the greatest driver of student achievement. So I think it starts with recruitment, and then teachers that you have, how do you build and keep developing to be the best teacher for all kids possible. And you mentioned too, instructional framework. We're a proud Avid school. So when we talk about what high quality instruction looks like in every classroom, regardless of the content area, building a system of reading for all kids, building a system of reading, both pre-reading, during reading, post-reading, or extension activities, that's essential. So we talk about a system of literacy in every classroom, and we continually work towards that and have seen some positive student outcomes as a result of that. And then certainly the inquiry and organization pieces and collaboration pieces that we want to build into our instructional framework, again, for every classroom. You mentioned the pipeline. I love that piece. We're working with a couple universities locally. Carroll University, when I started in teaching, largely your experiences in school happen your fourth or fifth year in student teaching, your fifth year in last semester. That is, you can't replicate that experience with the 4.5 previous years of an undergrad degree. Carroll, we've worked with Carroll University and University of Wisconsin-Whitewater to have teacher candidates here earlier. So their second or third year, they're serving as an Avid tutor. There's an intern or residency program where that's a 2 or 3 year commitment, not a semester commitment. And I think that's the opportunity to continue to build the skills where teachers are effective day one, knowing that it's a, to your point, Drew, a really complex profession. It's a lot different than 10 years ago. The complexity is much different. We're asking teachers to be teachers of reading, teachers of writing, teachers of all kids. And with that goes a consistent professional development model and a school focus and a school vision on all kids. And I think the last point I'd say is, I'm a big fan of that continuous improvement mindset and some of that organizational goals research that shows you that regardless of the sector, 2 or less goals, you have a successful completion rate of 90+%. When you add a third goal, it drops to 50%. So when you talk about aligning an organization or aligning this school, and in my context, what are the 1 or 2 school goals that everyone can align to within their content area that, again, provides students an opportunity for greater engagement and, more importantly, greater results in their academic achievement and learning.
So the UW-Madison dean that I had talked with was Diana Hess, and I thought that was her name, but I didn't want to say it and be wrong. It was from September of 2022 when we were actually still called Teach Thought Professional Development. We're now Thought Stretchers Education, but that's a whole other issue. So the pedagogy piece, and you mentioned inquiry, and I spend a lot of time on the podcast and in other places sort of trying to, I guess, think about and help people think about and sort of uncover some of the complexity and nuance in pedagogy and instruction. We do lots of project-based learning work. Everything that we do is through the lens of inquiry. But I often say is that project-based learning can be done really poorly, and one of those things that is often left out in let me say 2 things. One, because you mentioned engagement, and sometimes teachers can think about engagement in terms of like behavioral engagement. Oh, the kids love this; they're really engaged, which of course is important, but sometimes can overlook cognitive engagement. So we want to make sure that's happening. But then the sort of argument that direct and explicit instruction is good or bad or most effective for this, or inquiry is bad, and that's part of the battle, because I think about both of those being so I think about, let me put it this way, sort of direct and explicit instruction is really important in inquiry teaching and learning, or project-based learning, or those kinds of educational experiences as tools to help students to get that knowledge that is really important and necessary. But then inquiry and collaborative activities are really, really important. So I'm curious what you see from your teachers coming in and the professional development that you focus on and provide, sort of balancing those kinds of things.
Yeah, I love that question. We're fortunate to be have instructional coaches here at Brookfield East and throughout our school district. So we have three instructional coaches that have a hybrid position. They serve as an instructional coach, but they also teach. So they are still in the classroom, and I love that design model. I kind of think about your question around direct versus collaborative. And I think of that Jim Collins line about be wary of the myth of or. We know it's an and. We know that teacher design and instructional framework and lesson design that's really well done and aligns learning leads to increased learning for students. So I think we spend a lot of time on, again, from our Big Avid perspective, that Wicker framework over what are the rigorous learning expectations that all students are going to experience in all content areas. How are we going to leverage levels of thinking? So when I was a teacher, I lived in level one. All my assessments were aligned to level one type of questions. What, especially in social studies, what, when, what happened? And you think about, as we build really skilled critical thinkers and really skilled problem solvers, we need to know level one, right? I mean, you can't get to level two and level three without predicting, hypothesizing what's next, evaluate, synthesize, compare, contrast without an emphasis on level one, level two, level three. So I think our teachers do a masterful job of making sure that rigorous learning experiences are defined by not more, right? Not more work, but the right work that adds levels of complexity to make new meanings out of new information and connect that or stretch that to existing information. So it's a relentless pursuit to build problem solvers and critical thinkers here at all schools. And I think our AVID instructional framework has allowed us to continue to elevate that goal for all kids.
So then I'm curious if you get, because I see some evidence of this in sort of a movement from, I don't know, maybe not the best way to characterize it, but sort of more quote unquote conservative kinds of stakeholders and educators and that kind of thing, to really, really focus on knowledge, and knowledge being super, super important, that we're missing the boat on knowledge. And of course, this direct and explicit instruction is what they advocate for. And I don't disagree. I think that those are very, very important things. But I'm curious, to what extent do you get any pressure or pushback from parents who obviously are looking, hopefully, for the best interests of their own students, and thinking about, college and life preparation, all those things, but college and college entrance being a big piece for lots of them, and tests are a big piece of that, right? So there can be a pushback in terms of like, okay, so you're talking about all these critical thinking, some people might call them 21st century skills, soft skills, all these things, but are those really testable? Are they going to show up on an ACT or a college entrance exam and those kinds of things? And are we overlooking knowledge in that process, which again, sort of is a direct and explicit instruction kind of thing. So do you get any real pressure from parents and outside stakeholders on those kinds of things? And how do you think about those?
Yeah, I think every parent wants what's best for their student. And I think we've done a better job as a school of communicating expectations of learning, of content of learning, our curriculum. So for example, we deploy here at Brookfield East a Tuesday topic that is typically, schools really are great at communicating events, right? Like, here's when the fundraiser is, here's when this event is, and those are huge community events. So that's really important that we communicate that.
Sure.
We've started to, in the last couple of years, do a better job of communicating learning. Here's our school goals. Here's the critical reading process. Here's what inquiry looks like in all content areas. Here's what some of our priorities of success skills that you mentioned, Drew, and why they're important. And I think we have to do a better job of continually communicate that. And so the next step that we saw as a district was a weekly communication from our teachers about, here are the learning outcomes for the week, here's the assessments coming for the week, here's the schedule for the week. And I think that communication to bring an alignment with parents and students and staff all together with the same mission of everyone wants their student to succeed academically, and everybody wants their student to succeed as a great person. So I think not that it's the answer, but we've done a better job of communicating the brilliance that exists within our classrooms every day, and the goals and the vision of our school community.
Are there pieces that you intentionally try to work on, and oftentimes principals, at least one way to think about the principal job is, the one who gets the lights turned on and the bus is running and those kinds of administrative tasks, which are obviously important. And then there's sort of the instructional leadership, leader of the learning kinds of pieces. And some principals are great at one, some principals great at the other, and focus on one or the other and delegate kinds of things. So I'm curious how you see yourself in that role, but then also sort of the role of research and the ways that you ask your teachers and instructional coaches and instructional leaders to engage in educational research.
Yeah, I love that question. I think to answer first for my part, I think of driving priorities in the role of principal, the school culture. What role is the principal and teachers aligned to make sure every student is successful here, feels connected here, feels like they have a trusted adult. So that's number one. School, that old line, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Mm-hmm. Like, we have to build thriving school cultures. Instruction, we have to be relentless on what's our instructional focus. What does a high impact lesson look like? What's, again, back to that system of reading, that's going to be lifelong academic skills that a student will be thriving beyond our high schools or beyond whatever their next step are because of those key academic skills, reading, writing, problem solving, critical thinking, that we build in every classroom. I think leadership development is a big driver for the role of principal. I think you have to build teams. You have to build leaders, next up leaders that see themselves as leaders of their classroom, of leaders of their teams, of leaders in their departments, and leaders of our school. I often say we don't hire people to fall in line. We hire people to start new lines. So that constant belief that leaders truly live at every level. And then you think from a school perspective, how do you elevate the role of the student voice and student leadership to make sure students are leading their learning or see themselves in that space? How are they leading their clubs and activities and sports, leading our organization, leading within our community? So I would say those are probably the 3 or 4 driving position from the principal perspective.
And what about the research piece?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, we always have to be lead learners. You mentioned that term. Our instructional coaches, our teachers, our principal, our associate principals have to remain committed to growing according to the research. So our AVID background does a tremendous amount for our research pieces. When you think about about 85% of our student body goes on to a 2 or 4 year college experience past Brookfield East. You think about the research on accessing that curriculum and that content while in high school, setting you up for success your first and second year of the college or university experience is some of the most impactful research that you can read. So when you think about nearly every student in our class of 2023 accessed a college credit bearing course before they graduated here, we are hopefully taking steps where they are successful in their first and second year, and then do a better job of making sure that we ask them what did we do specifically that allowed them to have success that first or second year. But then I think too, the research piece, back to your knowledge component, we're ACT here in Wisconsin. So there's a state mandated March of every year, juniors take our ACT. And how do we audit that skills results to show strengths of the cohort or opportunities to grow. So when we talk about a system of reading, our class of 2023, a composite in the reading section of 24.4, it's a huge celebration for our commitment to reading and making sure every student can work through a really rigorous or complex text and identify the main idea or identify the claim, identify supporting facts or ideas, and then extend those supporting facts and ideas to greater meanings and greater understanding. So I think you're back to that complexity of knowledge and depth of knowledge research behind that.
Yeah, well, I have really leaned heavily into research in some of these conversations and talked with some researchers. And I've talked with John Hattie a couple times, and I'm assuming you know who John Hattie is. But I was in a workshop with a group of teachers and just asked, how many of you are familiar with John Hattie? And very few hands went up, and I was like, oh wow, it seems to me that lots of teachers should know who John Hattie, or certainly not the only one, but he's pretty, I guess, famous for, if you're going to say an educational researcher can be famous, but that's a big wonder for me. So one of the things that you mentioned,
and I agree with you, Drew, wholeheartedly. John Hattie's work and the meta-analysis that you look at. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there, but like the one driver, feedback, for example, like how do we build feedback systems that we know has a huge impact on student learning? And sometimes I think the traditional thought is it always needs to be teacher to student. You're in a class of 25 or 26, that can be really challenging. So how do you build a feedback system? I was in AP Psych class recently where the students built the rubric based upon the FRQ. They did a self-assessment, and then they shared papers, and then they did a peer assessment, and then the teacher over a day did a one-on-one meeting with every student in that classroom. So you think about educational research, what are the instructional moves that gives us the greatest benefit to engagement and learning, and how do we maximize those? Because we can't do everything. So the power of focus is something that we continue to need to prioritize. I think in my first year as a principal versus my 11th year, like we are trying to do our best with what move the needle on student learning and student engagement and adult practice the most. And to your point, we can't do it all anymore.
Right. Well, we never could, but certainly more added to the plate, it sure seems. And yeah, that research piece, I think, is, again, when I talk with direct and explicit instruction advocates, they say, and they will say, inquiry teaching is bad for kids, or things like that. And you're like, you got to be kidding me. And, bad inquiry teaching is bad for kids, just like bad direct and explicit instruction is bad for kids. And actually, when you put those two together, they can be really, really powerful. And Hattie, certainly talks about that, and other researchers as well. But when you talk about what's best for kids, and I love how Hattie says, don't do what works, but do what works best, or something like that. And again, then it's about the goes back to the mission and vision and purpose. Like, what are we really trying to do? And that's one of my concerns, that there's such a sort of narrow view of student success and teacher success as defined by they know things, and there's a sort of focus on, which is obviously important, a change in long-term memory, and Rosenshine's practices and all of those things, which again are very, very important, but only a part of the picture. And so when we think about the ways in which we're identifying and defining student success, is it in the short term? Is it in the medium term? Is it in the long term? And what are the things outside of just knowledge? Because knowledge is necessary but not sufficient. So, it really frustrates me. This is my time to jump on a soapbox here. Like, it frustrates me because it's like it's such a narrow view, and some people are just going to have to on both ends of that spectrum of sort of inquiry and progressive teaching, because that can be done really poorly, as well as the other can be done really poorly, and so people are just going to have to give up some of their whipping posts and be a little bit more humble and saying, all right, what do we really need to do to get sort of raise the ceiling on the educational process and outcomes for students? So not a question there, but feel free to respond to any of that.
One of my favorite moments as principal was when we onboarded AP Research and AP Seminar and made AP Seminar sort of like a first access point to AP rather than maybe a capstone that it's somewhat messaged at some point. But a student in AP Research did her project. You select a research project, and she researched about employability skills. And then to what extent do schools help build the employability skills? You mentioned it, Drew, soft skills. We relabeled it as success skills. And she facilitated 2 professional learnings for our entire staff about the notion of dependability, the notion of collaboration and teamwork, the notion of flexibility, that there's multiple pathways to reach that outcome, and then the note about problem solving. I think I said problem solving, collaboration and teamwork. So she brought a work group together the summer before her senior year and really level set what this could look like in the classroom, what this wouldn't look like in the classroom, and then how do we teach and model and coach around those collaboration, teamwork, flexibility, problem solving, dependability, matched with our academic priorities to ensure that both are important. We want students that graduate from our high school, not just the goal of graduation that maybe typically or traditionally the goal, but we want students to be leaders within our community. We want them to be successful in whichever pathway they select beyond Brookfield East. And I think that combination of academic skills, skilled readers, skilled writers, skilled critical thinkers and problem solvers, matched with dependability and flexible and a hopeful and can collaborate with people from different backgrounds and different ideas, could be, when you look at your eyes or your vision of what a graduate looked like, that intersection of both areas is really important.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was going to broach the sort of topic earlier of sort of student wellness, and I would like to touch on that because that seems to be a really, really important and growing in importance piece of the puzzle of the educational ecosystem. So I'm curious what you're seeing from your students as in terms of emotional health and wellness, and feel free to comment on the role of schools in helping with that. Again, adding something to the plate which is outside of the sort of strictly academic outcomes realm, and is that the right place? Is school the right place, and what's the role of school in that? I'm curious how you deal with phones in school, and what are some of the things that you're seeing that are maybe negative external impacts on student wellness?
Yeah, I love that question. I had the opportunity to talk to our governor this week, Governor of Wisconsin, Tony Evers, who called this the year of mental health for students. And I think that's really important. I think a year ago, we had a UW-Madison, a mental health provider, present his research to our staff, our entire district. And I think pre-pandemic, we saw figures of 2 out of 10 students experience depression or anxiety. His research associated with the LEO project shows 6 to 7, and it might be a little off here, but 6 or 7 out of 10 post-pandemic of students experiencing stress or anxiety or depression. And stress, I'd label bad stress. And so we are in our 6th year here at Brookfield East, and Brookfield Central is our 2 high school town here, on our journey of leveraging the work of the Hope Squad. The Hope Squad originated out of Utah. The Hope Squad goal was to decrease suicide ideation while also increasing advocacy for mental health wellness, mental health counseling, mental health access. And I think when I was a student, there was sort of a taboo topic, back in a time. And now all the research, and that's why we love the Hope Squad piece, students are 2 to 3 times more likely to connect with a peer than an adult in times of need. And the whole goal of the Hope Squad is to identify those students that are go-to leaders already within our school and community, and then train them up as point of first contact to serve as a connector for students in need to adults and resources that can meet their need and meet their mental health needs at that moment. And the best part, Drew, about our Hope Squad is they are community leaders, not only school leaders, and they continue to reinforce, whether through meetings, whether through panels in our community, whether through staff presentations, the proactive piece of wellness. And to your point, are you sleeping 8 hours a day? Are you on your phone consistently? Are you scanning social media that's a threat to kids that wasn't a threat when we were in high school? Are you drinking water? Are you eating your meals? Are you aligned to positive peers that are helping you grow in a sense of community? Are you connected to a club, sport, or activity? So some of those proactive wellness pieces that they've built are really inspiring. It's much different when the principal of a school says, here are the things that you need to do or be aware of. It's completely different when our selected student leaders are saying, you need to limit social media access. You need to sleep 8+ hours a day. You need, like those constant reminders that all of us need in our commitment to wellness.
So have you tackled the issue of phones in schools, and what does that look like there?
Yeah, so we have. I want to say it's our second or third year of the phone caddy that all of us can access on Amazon. So we're in a 4x4 block schedule. So it's about 90 minutes a class. So yeah, students are without their phone for the majority of the day, with the exception of passing periods and in lunch. And it's been an amazing difference for all of us. One of my favorite authors writes about distraction and how those of us with our phones always on, we never shut our brains down, and the opportunity to hyper focus on the work and sort of model the present piece. And I love our staff because I think so much of education is serving as our role model for kids, and it's important for us to model that as well. So I've gone days where I unfortunately have left my phones at home, and those have been some of the best days. You're just not tied or connected to it. So I think we're trying our best to elevate that conversation, continue to set goals for students about right-sizing tech usage, right-sizing social media usage, because I didn't touch upon there's positives. Obviously, there's positives. We know it makes the world much more connected, more so than ever before, but right-sizing some of those opportunities versus some of the stressors that kids have to navigate.
And how did the students respond to that, or how have they responded to that sort of, lack of access, or the shift away from being able to have them all the time?
They've been great. The student that I mentioned before that brought the student work group together a summer ago, it was about 15, a small group of kids, 15, 20 kids. And I had my phone. And one of the pieces that they talked about was the ability to distance yourself from your phone and technology and model the importance of the moment and the importance of that interaction. And none of the 15, Drew, had their phones out. And I had mine out. And I can learn something here. That's a story about the power of focus and the power of the moment that I'm continually trying to do better at.
Yeah. Well, on the issue of it's a difficult one, difficult for all of us. And, there's been there's been some, I think, important research, and Jonathan Haidt and the work that that he's doing on that. And I think he's coming out with a book that is related to this. But anyways, on the sort of topic of wellness, and one of the things that I think is related to, I mean, it's wellness of students, wellness of teachers, wellness of administrators and board members, and all the kinds of things, all the sort of stakeholders in the system. Again, are you seeing, and how much are you seeing, and what does it look like, sort of those external pressures, the sort of culture war kinds of pressures that we see all over social media, where people are really up in arms on, this topic, that topic, grooming, or, any of these sort of indoctrination kinds of I guess, accusations and threats and things like that? What does that look like from your perspective?
Yeah, I think, we've navigated here really adversarial Board of Education meetings, right, where you have this emerging conflicts. You mentioned 3 or 4 topics there that surfaced or have surfaced before. And I think as a school principal, I think that the communication strategy that we're deploying, I think too often as school leaders in schools in the last couple of years, you're sort of responding in reacting communication. Like, how do we continue to proactively communicate where here's all the learning targets for the class, here are the class resources being used, here are the approved textbooks, and being more proactive with our communication. And there's some success there. Everybody wants what's best for their kids, right? And that's the common ground all communities can rally behind. And we're hopeful that as a Hope School, we're hopeful that we can align our entire community around what's best for kids. And the line that you mentioned is a dear core value for us. Success looks differently for every student. Success is at an individual level. So if we agree upon, here are our transparent school goals: reading, writing, thinking, speaking, and problem solving. And around the academic relevancy piece, how do the academic skills and knowledge and dispositions help us be better tomorrow than we are today? And kind of continue to elevate that conversation around learning and telling our story in a much more celebratory way than even I did 10 years ago, I think is proved to be aligning for our school and for our community.
Have you seen, because one of the accusations that I hear pretty regularly, and I think there's some evidence to support this in some cases, I would say it's more likely that we would see it in geographic hotspots, East Coast, West Coast, big cities, but sort of the idea that our pre-service programs are producing sort of teachers as activists. And one of the things that we're doing here in our professional development is to work with schools to help them navigate, for example, one school said, we want to teach with neutrality. And so the idea that we sort of emphasize there is objective pluralism, right? So we want to lean into and say, we're not going to ban this. We're not going to say you can't teach about this and talk about this. I mean, you taught psych, I taught psych. There's all kinds of things in there where we talk about gender and sexuality and things that might trigger all kinds of outrage from a variety of stakeholders, right? So what I try to advocate for, and what we try to advocate, is the sort of application of liberal sciences, classic liberal, viewpoint diversity, pluralism, and really emphasizing that as a process that teachers understand and that students understand. And I'm curious what you've seen with teachers. I mean, have you seen teachers that sort of fit that sort of activist mode and might be sort of leaning towards that sort of authoritarian, illiberal approach of like, this is the truth and you can't say that and you must use this language and those kinds of things? And so do you sort of, have you done any intentional work on that, or felt the need to even do an intentional work on that?
Yeah, I think your point earlier about social studies teachers, that's our whole undergrad degree, right? Navigating conversation, controversial issues within a class environment. And I think our approved curriculum always allows at the local level or at the Wisconsin state level, local school boards adopt and approve curriculum. So to your point, I think our teachers serve as leaders in their classrooms for students to navigate increasingly complex issues in a way that they don't share their beliefs or opinions. They are simply facilitators of really rigorous, relevant learning experiences based upon the curriculum of their course area. So I think when we talk about science, for example, or social studies, for example, there's a number of contemporary or current topics that are associated with their curriculum that our teachers are trained and skilled at navigating. Here are, you think about some of the tools accessible to kids. There's a social studies tool, and I forget the name of the website right now, but it gives you newspapers across the country and how they communicate the same issue differently. And I think that's really important for students to understand the varying perspectives of issues. And it's really important for our teachers to facilitate. It's better to facilitate those discussions in a school and a organization committed to learning versus your first time as in the community where you've not wrestled with sort of what you think or, how you feel about that. So to answer your question, our staff and our teachers are brilliant at navigating conversations and facilitating conversations where students are engaged in really complex, rigorous discussions on issues as they are tied or connected to their curriculum.
So one of the short version of my hypothesis, a hypothesis I have, is that we have been living for decades since A Nation at Risk report in 1983, a sort of culture of achievement that is really focused on accountability, scores, and testing. And I contend that has had a downstream effect of decades of sort of teaching that has made it harder to do the kind of thing that you just described, right? That sort of back and forth of playing with ideas and differing opinions and differing perspectives. And so I'm curious if you have felt any of that sort of tension as a leader of a school with, testing and test scores and accountability, and how to have and foster and incentivize that kind of teaching where it's not necessarily pointed directly at the test.
Without a doubt, I think I'm a big fan of James Clear and Atomic Habits and his writing and his daily newsletter, weekly newsletter. And he talks about process versus outcome goals. I think so often in education, we're going to say, like I mentioned, the reading score before, Drew, 24.4 is going to grow to 24.5 by, in 2 years, an outcome measure. And consistently trying to equip our, work with our kids and student leadership teams. How do we build process goals and process mindsets where if reading is the outcome, that we're skilled readers is the outcome, what are the inputs that we're committed to within every classroom to make sure that we're aligned where the results take care of themselves, right? Like the controllables are the inputs. Academic achievement is really important. The student's academic success is our top driver. How every student does academically here at East is really important. But what are the inputs that we continue to build within every classroom? The reading, the writing, the critical thinking, the problem solving, the feedback piece we mentioned earlier from both a peer instruction, small group, large group piece that allows sort of those outcomes to be aligned to the inputs. So I think it's really important to concentrate on the process pieces that we can control with the goal that the outcome with alignment takes care of itself.
Well, there's lots more we could talk about, but as a principal is always needing to do, you have a state is it state championship soccer game to get to, or state playoffs soccer game to get to?
Yes, we won a thrilling sectional final last week. We won 3-2. We were down 2-0, and we've qualified for the state semifinal today. So that is where we are taking approximately 1,000 of our 1,400 kids too. So it should be a great event here in southeastern Wisconsin.
Nice. Well, National Principal of the Year for the NASSP, Andy Farley. Anything that you'd like to share as far as links or resources or books you're reading or anything like that before we jump off and you head to the hopefully not too cold soccer game?
Yeah, it's up to 45 degrees today, so it's great. The research, I think, student leadership is a big driver here, and I probably didn't emphasize that enough, Drew. And I think our Hope Squad and our Hope Squad story and the student leadership that's emerged in that space, I think about Hope for Utah and that role that Hope Squads are trying to elevate the work of wellness and student leadership throughout the country. So that would be a resource that I share. You made a reference to books, Atomic Habits by James Clear. I shared this at the principal conference last year. That's a book that's changed my life. I think it helps us, gives us permission to focus on what's most important and the moves that allow those most important outcomes to take place. So those are two priorities and goals that are always top of my mind.
All right. Well, we'll try to make sure those are in the show notes and links and that kind of thing. And I think it's nassp.org is the website for the National Association of Secondary School Principals. Andy, I appreciate the conversation, the time, and best of luck in the soccer game.
Yeah, thank you, Drew. I appreciate your time and being on this today. I really appreciate it.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.